why is it that most Americans seem to want one thing, but we always get another in a democracy? Why is it that we never seem to resolve practically any of these big mysteries? I mean, I don't think anybody would claim, even those who believe that those 19 hijackers hijacked those planes, and perhaps they did, I don't really know. But nevertheless, there's more of a story there of how they were able to pull off such a... as a journalist and as a human being, I'd like to know. And yet, if you even ask that question, people immediately start, kind of backing away. By the same token, there also are a lot of people in this country who rush to the most extreme explanation of everything. And, I myself and anybody at Who What Why find ourselves sort of having to kind of push back at people who are always demanding, why don't you tell exactly how those buildings were brought down, which we all know. And I say, well, if you all know, then why are you asking me to tell you? We don't know. I don't know. I mean, those kinds of things are very, very complex technically, and just because somebody posts something on the internet and says that they're an expert doesn't mean that they are, or even if they are an expert, that they're any more right than the other expert who tells you the opposite. And so really good journalism goes in and kind of does this all the way through, and then finally tries to figure it out. So with Family of Secrets, I began focusing on George W., and I wanted to know, how could a guy like him become president of the United States? That really was it. Even if you think even if you like him and you voted for him, which is fine, you still have to wonder, why him? I mean, why not more a kind of a Romney-like figure or a Bob Dole-like figure or whatever? And so that was interesting to me. And then I got a hold of the campaign filings for Bush, and they're like this thick, okay, the stack of paper. And each page has 20 or 30 or 40 names. And you look at them, and they're people giving huge amounts of money. And I thought, well, I never even heard of these people. But it's like you go, Midland, Texas, and name after name after name, and Houston, and generally not the inner city, generally wealthy suburbs, but name after name after name. And I thought, well, who are these people and why are they so excited by this guy? And so I gradually realized that there was tremendous loyalty to the Bush family because the Bush family represented something that they all got, which I didn't get. And I began to get it as I thought, well, he wouldn't have been president, really, if his father hadn't been president. I don't think anybody would dispute that. If he was just running on his own accomplishments, I don't think it would have happened. So I began thinking about the father, and then I thought, well, what's the story with the father? And then I started asking people, what about the father? And they said, oh, well, quite a gentleman. He's a gentleman. That's what everybody said. A real gentleman, real soft-spoken, very different than the son, much more moderate, much more cautious, and so forth. And I said, well, what did he represent? Why was he president? Because I remembered him as a kind of a goofball. Do you remember that? He was not articulate, really not that much more than the son, I don't think. He kind of confessed he had trouble with that vision thing. Like he really couldn't quite figure out what he thought about anything. I mean, in terms of leadership qualities, and then all those weird things. Remember, he threw up on the Japanese prime minister. I think he just ate the wrong thing, or maybe he was poisoned. I think somebody in the family said he'd been poisoned. But whatever it was, it was a curiosity, and I thought, well, how did the father become president? So I began looking at the father, and I thought that I'll work my way back to the son. And the result was that Family of Secrets is about, a little more than half is about the father, who turns out to be the most interesting character. And what I did was I was interested in, when I said to people, why was he president? They said, well, he'd been director of the CIA, as if it's the most natural thing that somebody who runs a spy agency should head the largest democracy in the world. Of course, if you live in Russia, you understand that with Vladimir Putin. But I thought, well, that seems sort of strange. And then he was only director for a year, and then, boy, they named the CIA headquarters after him, not after Allen Dulles. And I thought, well, that's kind of strange. What did he really do in a year? Let's see, what year was that? Oh, that's kind of interesting. That was when they were holding those church committee hearings where they were investigating CIA mind control experiments, MK Ultra, using LSD on unsuspecting Americans, being involved in unauthorized murder plots and opening people's mail, and here and abroad, and they were like, this is kind of crazy and out of control. That's what the senators were saying. This is dangerous. And right at that moment, when the CIA was really on the defensive, of all the people in the world, they brought in mild-mannered George H.W. Bush, no background or experience or familiarity with intelligence at all, we were told, if you go back and you read all the major newspapers of the period. their explanation was, well, you know, they wanted to kind of project a good image. He was a former congressman. He could appeal to congressmen. He was clean cut. He was this and that and so on. I thought, well, that seems sort of ridiculous. I mean, would you really do that if you had a lot to hide and you needed somebody who knew how to do that? Would you bring in an outsider? So I thought, that seems sort of strange. Plus, he's not even that articulate. They could have gotten another congressman. I mean, there were plenty of them who probably would have done it. So that seemed strange to me, and I began focusing on that. And what I discovered really kind of gave me chills. I discovered that this guy was not a novice, that he was a spook, that he didn't want people to know that he'd been a spook. That's why they brought him in. He'd always been a spook. He'd been a spook for years and years and years, decades. He had been a spy. When he was a congressman, he was a spy. When he was the UN ambassador, he was a spy. All of these things. But the presidents didn't know he was a spy. They just thought he was whatever he presented himself as. And so I thought, well, that's really, really interesting. And then I traced him up to his own path to the presidency. And I found all these interesting things, like his relationship with Richard Nixon. And this intrigued me because I thought, well, Richard Nixon went down in Watergate. You remember that or have heard of it, I hope. I just recently spoke to a college class and I mentioned Watergate and they gave me blank stares. I literally had no idea what it was. Yeah, I had to say, it's a building, a guy named Nixon, and Nixon, you know. So anyway, Watergate, and so Nixon went down, and there was George H.W. Bush. He was the UN ambassador, and then he became the head of the Republican Party at that moment that all of this was going on. So I thought, well, there's got to be a lot in all these biographies of him and so on about what he did during Watergate. Was he involved? Was he not involved? So on. And I went to look, and there was nothing. And I looked at his own writings, and there was almost nothing. And I thought, wow, this guy is like the anti-Zelig. You know, Zelig, the guy who's always in the picture? This is a guy who's in the picture but never shows up in the final snap. And I thought, this is amazing. How does he do that? And then I remembered Iran-Contra. You remember that? He said he was out of the loop. And I thought, well, how was he out of the loop? I mean, Reagan was out of the loop. Reagan was the vice president. He was out of the loop on everything. Bush was in the loop on everything. Bush was basically running the country under Reagan. This is the real story, again, that we haven't really gotten from the mainstream media, that Bush was really running the country.
What country was he spying for?
Well, that's a very interesting metaphysical question, because he was working for U.S. intelligence, but what that means is a long discussion. In any case, so I began looking at, well, what did he do with Watergate, and that made me, I looked at some things he did, and I thought, well, that's strange. Well, that's really odd. And here he is, and then there's his buddy, fellow Skull and Bones guy, and I get him on tape talking to Nixon, and he's telling, Nixon's like, why don't we just put it all out in the open? What did we do? Who did what? Let's just, how bad can it be? Have you ever heard this? You never heard this tape, right? And Nixon's actually saying, well, why in the world did they do that? Okay, if one of our guys, let's just put it out there. And then this Skull and Bones guy.
Are we talking about Nixon?
Yeah.
And the Watergate.
And Watergate. And so this Skull and Bones guy says to him, no, Mr. President, I don't think that would be a good idea. He's telling Nixon not to open up and just put it out there. And then I looked this guy up, and he's in touch with George Bush, and then I discovered that George Bush is in touch with John Dean, and John Dean is telling Nixon, Mr. President, there's some things you don't know about. And then I see that Dean was ordering the burglars in. You know, and I'm like, wait a minute, John Dean's now this great liberal hero going around, everybody loves him, he writes books about, you know, the failures of conservatism. I'm like, there's something really creepy going on here. And then I found that Dean's brother-in-law was connected with the CIA. And then I looked at the tapes, and I found, how did they even find out about the Watergate tapes? And then it was Alexander Butterfield, who turned out that he had worked for the CIA. And this had never come out before. And then, you know, Eagle Krogh, the guy who brought Dean into the White House, had his own connections to Vietnam and the covert stuff around the Strategic Hamlet program and so forth. And I was like, my God, there is a whole history of this country that comes out of simply asking the question, why George W. Bush? And it went deeper and deeper and deeper. And then as I was becoming increasingly fascinated with H.W., I looked at Kitty Kelly, you may remember, wrote a best-selling book about them. And in the book she mentions that he had once been interviewed, and very benignly, because, you know, most of the interviews are extremely softball, and they asked him, well, what are some of the interesting, you know, the milestones in your life? What do you remember about, like, the day Kennedy was shot? Where were you, and what were your thoughts? Well, let's start. Where were you when you heard Kennedy was shot? And H.W. says, God, just don't remember.
Oh.
And so I always ask, and I'll have to ask here, how many of you were 5 years old or over on November 22, 1963? Okay, all right. And how many of those of you who were do not remember where you were there? Okay, this is interesting. Now in Santa Fe we had one fellow, and he's only the second one. I've been doing this all over the country and abroad. Even in Italy they know where they were. So we've only had 2 people who didn't know where they were, but I wasn't sure they knew where they were when they were doing the event. So in any case...
Don't forget he worked in the CIA and the acid was a lot stronger then, so you know you could...
That's right, the acid is a lot stronger. All right, so in any case, I thought that was very interesting, and I thought there are 2 questions. Why won't he say where he was, and also, where was he? And so this is how I and Who, What, Why do our journalism, is we just go and we say, let's figure out where he was. Well, that took several years. So while I was working on Family of Secrets, I ran multiple research tracks at the same time. And I thought, I'm going to just figure out where this guy was. Well, this took me into another Lulu land, which was the Kennedy assassination. And just like Watergate, with Watergate, I thought Nixon, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Mitchell, bad guys, Woodward, Bernstein, Dean, blah, 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 medium or good guys. I completely changed my sense of what Watergate was, and I then changed, I don't say changed my opinion on the Kennedy assassination because I had none. Probably many of you do and many of you don't. You know, there's so much Sturm und Drang out there on that issue. People have very strong opinions. There's a million books. Usually what you do is if you don't have time to really dig into that stuff, you just say, there's a lot of noise there. I'm not, it's like choosing between the Yankees and the Red Sox or whatever your local teams are here. If you don't really have a strong feeling on it, you just stay out of the way. So I stayed out of the way, and most journalists do, because this is just a kind of very controversial material. It mostly gets you in trouble. But I thought, I'm going to start digging into this. And the more I dug, the more I said, oh boy, there's another history here I just didn't realize. And that history of what happened to Kennedy connects to a lot of other things that have been happening in this country. And they connect to people like Mr. Bush and his friends and the CIA and oil companies and banks and so on. And as these things began to strike me, and I started looking at other presidents like Jimmy Carter, and I saw what caused him to be limited to 1 term, and how he had, for example, gone into the CIA and said, we're going to take away these people's reckless covert operations capacity because it's not right in a democracy. And they said, oh yeah, you are? And then I went back and I looked at Dwight Eisenhower, and you remember his warning about the military-industrial complex? Eisenhower was worried about them. Nixon was worried about them. Truman was worried about them. Truman, after, he's the guy who basically signed all of these entities, the CIA, NSA, and so on, into existence. Exactly 30 days to the day after Kennedy's assassination, he wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post where he said the CIA was never supposed to be allowed to be operational. He said, we never authorized that. They were supposed to be just a very small outfit that just collected and analyzed information for the president when he needed them to do that. And he basically said that, that's Harry Truman, he basically said, I was tricked. And the fact that he published that 30 days to the day after Kennedy's assassination, many people think was not a coincidence, that he was basically saying, hey, you better take another look at this outfit because it's out of control, it's not working the right way in a democracy. Anyway, I don't want to go on and on about this, but Family of Secrets is one revelation like that after another. And as I began to see that I had missed in my journalistic career, even though, if you go all the way back, I wrote in the early 90s a piece for the Village Voice called CIA Out of Control, and it kind of has some of these themes, and it goes on for 10 pages of a big tabloid-sized paper, but I was mostly writing about what they were doing abroad, and I really didn't know much about what they were doing here. And it's really about what's going on in this country that we need to look at. Democracy is being foiled at every turn, and the media is singularly not up to the job. Either they don't understand this, or they're scared of it, or it's too big, it's too complicated, it's too difficult to do this story. I get a lot of these journalists privately who say, yeah, I remember when I was discovering what I was discovering in my research for Family of Secrets, I called a friend who works for the New York Times and has won some of the top journalism awards, and I said, I need to meet you for lunch. Feel like I'm losing my mind. I said, this stuff is just it's too comic book, it's just too bizarre. I mean, how could these things even be real? And he came and he met me for lunch, and I started telling him what I had and showing him, and he just sat there without saying a word. And I said, listen, if I'm making a mistake here, if I'm walking off a plank, and I'm about to, fall into the sea with all of these sharks there. Would you please just tell me? And he looked at me and he said, you better watch your back.
That's what I, really.